Hi guys, BuildZoid here, and today we're going to be talking about VRM thermals on two more AM4 motherboards, the MSI X470 Gaming Pro Carbon, which is sitting up here, and the X470 Aorus Ultra Gaming Board, which is sitting somewhere over there, and we're going to put it up there as well when we get to the hardware. So I don't have an excuse for why this video took so long to get around to doing, which is why I'm doing both boards at the same time instead of doing a video for each board, because I just decided, well, that is stupid anyway. So anyway, let's get right into it, because there's nothing else really worth addressing. If you want to know the actual details of the PCBs, I've done PCB breakdowns for both of these motherboards. So, you know, if you want to check those out, I'm going to link those down in the description below. And, yeah, but the MSI board here, you know, we're still going to go over some basics for the VRM. So the MSI board is using an International Rectifier 35201 voltage controller, which is your standard high-end international rectifier fully digital international rectifier voltage controller. You will find this on high-end Z370, X299 boards, AM4 like X470 boards, X399 boards, like anything high-end produced in the last couple of years, probably on an IR35201. This thing's been in use at least since Z170, and it's not going to stop being popular anytime soon. Unless Intel or AMD change voltage regulator standards. So yeah, very, very common voltage controller. Here it's configured on the MSI board, it's configured in a 5+2 phase configuration, and well, there's no doublers actually running on this motherboard. So the driving of the phases is actually taken care of by 5 CHL8510s and a international rectifier 3598. So the end result is that the VRM, which looks a hell of a lot like a 10 phase, for the V-core portion and +2 for the SoC is actually just a 5+2 phase. There's twice as many inductors and MOSFETs per each phase, so you have 2 high sides, 2 low sides, 2 inductors in every phase, controlled by 1 CHL8510, which basically means that this interleaves as a 5-phase. MSI also put 2 8-pins on the motherboard, but I can assure you that your R7 2700X is not going to pull to 400 watts or higher anytime soon, so the second 8-pin connector is completely bloody pointless, because there's no way your 2700X is going to pull enough power to overload one of those connectors, much less need a second one. So, yeah, but it is there, it's just completely pointless. For the MOSFETs, MSI has opted for a 4C029N from On Semiconductor for the high side, and for the low side they're using a 4C024N. Both of these MOSFETs are actually, like, as far as the discrete MOSFETs go on AM4 motherboards, these are the nicest ones I've encountered so far. So, solid MOSFETs, solid voltage controller, solid drivers. I like this VRM. On paper, this already looks really, really solid. For cooling, MSI opted for this block for the 4 phases that you have located over here, because the VRM, you basically have V-core VRM is basically 4 phases here, 4 phases, 1 phase up here, and then you have your 2 SoC phases. So this block takes care of 4 of the phases. You can see the imprints of the MOSFETs in the thermal pad. So yeah, thermal pad is not particularly thick. I would have it as a guess that that's like that might be like a millimeter thick thermal pad. Not the most amount of surface area, very heavy though. Like, this heatsink is really heavy. It is just one fat block of aluminum. And so it does take forever for this motherboard to get up to temperature. I was doing, like, the thermal testing runs were just like hour before I was taking temperatures, because it takes a month to get up to operating temperature, thanks to these heat sinks. So, yeah, and then the SoC VRM and the one V-core phase get this heatsink all to themselves, which is a lot less jagged and easier to hold because of that. Like, seriously, this thing is sharp. Like, these are sharp. This is painful to hold. But this is a lot less jagged. And I actually think that they use this heatsink on some of the lower end motherboards as the actual V-core VRM cooling heatsink, which, like, I'm not surprised. This thing is heavy, and it has a decent, again, you know, well, you can kinda see the fins there. You know, decent amount of finnage, again, well, decent. By today's heatsink standards, decent. Compared to what Asus puts on their motherboards in the same price point as this thing, This is a lot of fins. What Asus considers fins is just like depressing. So that's the VRM cooling situation on this. So overall, on paper, this looked really, really promising, and it still managed to surprise me. So let's switch over to the Gigabyte board. And here we have the X470 Ultra Gaming from Gigabyte. Now, Gigabyte likes to advertise this VR. Well, I think, do they still advertise it? I'm not sure, but I've already complained once about Gigabyte advertising this VRM as an 8+3 phase, and some of the boards, I know they took that down. I've not checked for this one specifically. But this is advertised on the box of the board that I have, because I bought it a while ago, as an 8+3 phase VRM. This is not actually true, because the voltage controller is a ISL 95712, which is a 4+3 phase voltage controller, so it's running in 4+3 phase mode. You get 4 phases for VCore, you get 3 phases for SoC. Gigabyte has twice as many inductors, has 2 inductors and 2 high sides and 2 low side MOSFETs in each of the phases. So they're doing the same thing as MSI to look like they have more phases than they really have. Unlike MSI, they didn't bother with adding an extra power connector that the motherboard is never ever going to need. So that's something, I guess. I don't have the plastic I/O cover on this board, but this one is a lot more covering than the MSI one. Not that it actually, like, I didn't bother to remove this because it didn't warrant, like, basically I was like, if this motherboard actually overheated, I would look into upgrading the cooling until it stopped overheating, but I didn't actually need to do that. So that kind of gives away some of the results. But yeah, it does have this plastic I/O shield, which would normally be right there, and the VRM heatsink hiding under that is actually reasonably substantial, a massive improvement over what they were running on X370, which actually the VRM itself is an upgrade over X370, because on X370 they were running only like 1 high side MOSFET per phase and 2 low sides, if I remember correctly. They weren't doing 2 high side MOSFETs, though the MOSFETs didn't actually change. This is still on 4C10Ns. And, 4C10N MOSFETs and 4C06s from On Semiconductor, which are much, much worse than the MOSFETs that MSI was using on that MSI is using on the Gaming Pro Carbon. But Gigabyte has a few little tricks that they use to make sure that the VRM doesn't get quite as hot as it could. So, yeah, that's kind of the VRM situation. But for the cooling, you're looking at this block of aluminum, which, as I said, is rather substantial, decent amount. Well, again, by modern heatsink designs, motherboard heatsink design standards, this is a decent amount of surface area. This cools only 3 of the VCore VRM phases, as you can see the imprints right there. That's only, how many is it? 12 MOSFETs, when the VCore VRM is, of course, composed of 8. So what's going on with that? Similar to the MSI motherboard, they have the last phase of the VCore VRM sitting under this heatsink, along with the SoC phases. And the reason why why you would want to do that is if you're running a 2700X, then the 2700X is actually not going to push really much current or much power through the SoC whatsoever. So the SoC VRM is going to stay ice cold if you're running a 2700X, 2700, 2600X, 2600. Like, none of these chips uses the SoC VRM that much. And so putting one of the VCore phases on this heatsink significantly reduces the, helps the, it basically puts 25% of the VCore VRM's total heat on a completely separate heatsink from the other one. So, that's a good design decision, because this heatsink will run really, really cool, so that phase will get plenty of cooling to itself, and the other 3 phases are stuck sharing the other block. But so that's basically very similar approaches to the actual cooling design. Big aluminum blocks. The Gigabyte ones aren't quite as heavy as the MSI ones. This is a lot. This is quite a bit heavier than this is. This didn't take quite as long to heat up, because this Gigabyte VRM also does run rather hot, just because it's not particularly efficient. Some downsides with the Gigabyte motherboard worth mentioning: this thing only has offset voltage control, which means setting this motherboard to run at 1.4 volts output is a bloody nightmare, because there's also no load line calibration. So Voltage control on this motherboard bloody sucks. I would generally, like, just on the basis of how bad the voltage control on this motherboard is, I would not recommend it for static overclocks. So if you want to do something like overclocking your 2700 to like 4.15 or 4 to 4.2 gigahertz, I've heard that they generally don't clock as well as 2700X's. But if you're looking to hit sort of 4 to 4.2 gigahertz on a 2700, doing it with this board is going to be way harder than with a lot of other boards because this doesn't have static voltage settings and it doesn't have load line calibration. Also, the VRM runs at a much lower switching frequency than most of the other boards I've tested, which would, in theory, lead to even worse overclocking performance. Just ignoring the voltage control issues, just the VRM will generally have more output ripple than some of the other motherboards because it runs at a lower switching frequency, and it'll have worse transient response because it runs at a lower switching frequency. The downside is it makes the VRM run less hot, and that's one of the tricks that is just like, that's one of the reasons why this motherboard didn't run, like, I expected it to get really hot, and it still got pretty damn hot, but not hot enough for me to go like, okay, this is a fail. And part of that is that Gigabyte runs this VRM at 350 kilohertz switching frequency instead of, say, 450, which the MSI Gaming Plus board, the X470 Gaming Plus, which is roughly the same price, lacks some of the features that this has. That board runs 450 kilohertz switching frequency. So that's something to keep in mind, is just like some of these VRMs will have, electrical, like they might run similar temperatures, but some of them have electrical advantages compared to the others just because of how they're set up, and they trade some of their thermals for that. But the other thing worth mentioning with this board is this has a clock gen, and a clock gen it's not really a killer feature, okay? Because the thing is, if you want to really max out your single core boost, then you need a clock gen. The counter argument to that is that clock gens don't like M.2 SSDs. I've heard of everything from M.2 SSDs not being detected to M.2 SSDs being straight up corrupted by BCLK overclocking. So, if you want to use an M.2 SSD, you might not be able to use that feature because it'll just not work with the SSD. The other thing to keep in mind with the BCLK overclocking is a stock 2700X with just precision boost overdrive overclocking is going to hit like 4.25 gigahertz, 4.3 gigahertz pretty regularly for single core workloads once you max out the PBO settings. If you try to stack the BCLK on top of that, you're not real, like, at best you're going to go from like 4.3 to 4.5. And that's not a very big increase in frequency. Okay, that's really not a huge, that's single-digit percentage improvement. And in my opinion, that is just like, considering how much hassle it is to do that, and also the weakness, like this VRM is probably too weak to support that kind of overclocking anyway. It's an interesting feature. I just wouldn't consider it particularly killer. Fortunately, I don't have another motherboard to compare. Well, I don't have a 2600X because I really think that this motherboard would be a perfect fit for a 2600X because of the VRM situation and then the BCLK. Because it does, like, this is the cheapest motherboard with a clock gen that I'm aware of. And that's a really cool feature to have if you're going to PBO overclock. The thing is, with a 2700X, your PBO on its own at stock settings is pretty much maxed out. Once you throw some of the adjustments on it through the BIOS, it's more maxed out. And then the BCLK overclocking generally doesn't work that well, in my experience. On the Asus motherboards, it's a straight up nightmare. I don't know how anybody works with it because it just makes, like, it basically gives you a minute of dead time after booting into Windows. Gigabyte motherboards don't have that issue, but it's really hard to stability test. And the performance gains are still single-digit percentages. Also, my 2700X straight up doesn't do much more than 4.4 gigahertz single core. It crashes if I try to go above that. So, it's like Silicon Lottery might even, like, if you lose the Silicon Lottery on your CPU, the usefulness of the BCLK gets even worse. So, worth considering. Now then, let's talk test methodology before the thermal results. And I am dragging this out, aren't I? Anyway, so this is the test methodology. I do test inside a case because obviously testing on an open air test bench is not particularly fair, because that's not really a realistic scenario. And also, if you're on an open air test bench, I can't imagine like, if you're having VRM thermal issues on an open air test bench, just throw a bloody fan on top of the board. It'll sit there, like gravity will hold that fan in place. You don't need to do anything. Inside a case is a different issue. You might have to use zip ties to do that, and some people value aesthetics. So this is the case I tested. This is a Corsair Carbide 400C. It was, I think, wait, is it a 400C carbide? I think it is. I can't remember. Yeah, it is. It is, because it's one of the budget cases from Corsair with the hinged side panel. So, and plexiglass. Yeah. So, anyway, I test on a 400C. The reason why I test on a 400C is because I basically went to Steve from Gamers Nexus. Gamers Nexus do a ton of case reviews, and I basically asked, I need a cheap, average air cooling case. And I'd like it to have a hinged side panel so that it's easy to swap systems in and out of. And he's like, and well, he wanted to recommend some other things, but I eventually came across this thing and I was like, yo, is this pretty average? And he was like, yeah, it's pretty average. So that's why I tested that. It's apparently pretty average at cooling, compared to a lot of the other cases, because it has the full, like, it has the fully blocked off front side panel, except for the side vents that you can see in the picture. And, you know, it has the mesh top. Comes with 2 fans, PSU in the bottom. It's not special in any way, shape, or form, and that's what really I was going for, like generic as generic an operating scenario as possible, or average scenario as possible. So that's why I went with this case. For the cooling configuration, as you can see, I have the CPU radiator set as intake. The reason why I go with that is because that's the best way to get low CPU temperatures, having the radiator as anything but intake. Like, if you have the radiator as exhaust, it's going to run hotter than if you have it as intake. It's that simple. The inside of your case is always going to be hotter than the outside of your case, right? So intaking air from pretty much anywhere is better than exhausting it through a radiator, because the goal of the radiator is to take cold air and heat it up. And if the cold air is 30 degrees instead of 25 degrees because your GPU ran through the air first, well, the radiator is going to be 5 degrees warmer because of that. So radiators set as intake, basically for CPU temperature purposes. Also because the CPU generally puts out less heat than a GPU, so how much it'll actually raise the air temperature is less. Because obviously some people might want to prioritize GPU thermals, but I'm just prioritizing CPU thermals here. And it also means that the case balance in the, the fan balance inside the case is better, because I don't, like, if the rad was exhaust, then I'd have more exhaust than intake, arguably, or it would be like a weird airflow scenario. So this just made the most sense to me, both thermally and just keeping it kind of average. The GPU is an R9 Fury. It only really matters when I run the 3D Mark Firestrike test, which so far that test has proven that every motherboard does not get that hot in 3D Mark Firestrike combined, which that test runs both GPU and CPU at the same time at a pretty heavy level. So I figured I'd use that because it just seemed like, okay, that's a pretty good mixed workload. It doesn't really seem to be huge, like, it doesn't run that hot in general, so the GPU kind of, well, like, the GPU does affect that test, but it's not that important, because that test so far hasn't gotten anywhere near being failed by any motherboard I've tested. So yeah, for the memory, I'm on Team Group T-Force Extreme 3733 CL18 memory, but it's clocked down to 3200 CL14 because that's just really easy settings to run on Ryzen. You can run higher frequencies, you can run tighter timings, but 3200 CL14 is really easy to do, and every single one of the motherboards does it. Nothing ever complains, very easy to stabilize. I don't need to put any work into it, so I run it at that, and it's also not 2133, because running 2133 is just like, you shouldn't do that. Not with the 2700X, please. So yeah, both of the exhaust fans are just the fans that came with the case. I think they run pretty close to 1,000 RPM, and they're just running full speed the whole time. The radiator is allowed to basically go up and down with CPU temperature, but ultimately it ends up maxed out for all of the tests because the 2700X kicks out a lot of heat and does get very hot. So I do actually make sure that, like, if for some reason the radiator wasn't going up to full speed, I would actually go and manually set it to full speed, because otherwise it's not fair for the testing. So then, that's the front side of the case, and obviously I closed the side panel. That's why I wanted a hinged one, so that I wouldn't have to bother with taking it on and off all the time. So I closed this side of the case. On the back side of the case, I actually run that open because it gives me access for oscilloscope and also the temperature probe. The temperature probe is a K-type thermocouple, and the stuff that looks like yellow bubblegum right here, that's actually a really squishy thermal pad. And it's all torn up and stuff, but it is thermal pad, and it doesn't really affect the VRM temperatures much at all. Measuring the temperature from the back of the motherboard like this, the K-type is actually jammed right up against the leg of an inductor that's roughly in the middle of the VCore VRM. The reason why I do this is the inductor's leg is a metal to, basically it's a constant metal connection directly to the silicon of the MOSFET. Or whatever, well, there are power MOSFETs made with other materials, but we'll just call it silicon. There's more exotic MOSFETs out there as well, but we're just going to ignore those. So it's basically a direct metal connection, so it gets very close in terms of temperatures to real temperatures. And it's so far, like, doing it this way has been confirmed as very like it's easy to set up, and it is actually pretty reliable based on all of the motherboards that I've tested that actually have working temperature readings. The motherboard sitting in the case right here, the Asus X470 Prime Pro, this is one of the motherboards that doesn't have working temperature readings. This thing shut down when that K-type thermocouple was reading 118 degrees Celsius on the back of the board. The motherboard at the time was reporting something like 45 degrees VRM temperature in software. Asus software bloody sucks. Well, no, it's because Asus has that weird sensor situation going on, and so, I don't know, like, temperature readings on this motherboard are complete garbage. It was hitting, like, way over 100, and it just never went above 45 in software, so I don't know what's up with that. And that was when I was doing testing. I haven't retested it since. I still wouldn't recommend the motherboard even if they fix that, because there's other motherboards that do basically everything this one does better. So then, let's get on to the actual test results. Here they are, and I have included all of the different motherboards. So that's the Prime Pro from Asus. That's the Gaming Plus, which so far is my favorite. Well, actually, this stays my favorite cheap X470 VRM. This is actually, I think this is straight up the cheapest X470 motherboard you can buy from between, like, MSI, Gigabyte, Asus, ASRock. I know BioStar exists, but BioStar doesn't know how memory is supposed to work, so I wouldn't recommend them to you in a million years. So that's, like, their RAM overclocking just sucks all the time. Every generation, every motherboard they've ever made, I've never heard of one that didn't have memory overclocking problems. So, you know, out of the motherboard vendors that make good motherboards, MSI is currently leading for, like, the budget X470 motherboard with the Gaming Plus. And that stays unchanged as the X470 Ultra Gaming hits 115 degrees Celsius while running 350 kilohertz switching frequency compared to 450. And most of that is MSI has, I'd say, slightly better heatsink. But most importantly, the MSI X470 Gaming Plus is on the exact same MOSFETs that I really, really like off of the Gaming Pro Carbon. So MSI was doing 107 with 1.4 volts VCore. Gigabyte was doing 115. That's software temperature reading. On the back of the board, it was actually reading 107, whereas the MSI was reading 104. So I think I was on the Gigabyte board, I was obviously not measuring the ideal spot, but it was still pretty close. Yeah, but both boards at least have working temperature readings, so, you know, Gigabyte has software temperature readings, and they do have over temperature protection. The board will shut down if it gets too hot. So that's nice. So you have some safety features, but it's just like the crappy voltage control, the lack of LLC, the low switching frequency. It's just like I wouldn't put an 8-core in it even if it didn't overheat. And honestly, with the fact that I was in a 20, like at the time of testing, the ambient temperature was 24 degrees Celsius. That's the temperature of the air going inside the case through the front intake. You know, if you were in a warm climate in summer, this would actually go very much like this would go from 115 to 125, and that would be a straight up fail. So yeah, I mean, I'm impressed. Like, I'm surprised that the motherboard didn't shut down, but I'm not surprised that it ran particularly hot. So yeah, it's just like I'd say if you're going to run like a 2600X and you want to mess around with BCLK overclocking, knock yourself out. That's a great board for that. If you want a motherboard that won't overheat with like a 2700 even, this exists right here, the MSI X470 Gaming Plus. Now, what if you want a really solid VRM? Gaming Pro Carbon. Like, it says right there. Whoa. There's a reason. So, the VRM switching frequency on the Gaming Pro Carbon is configurable, as it uses the IR35201, which is a fully digital voltage controller. So, that's what Gigabyte is referring to when they say hybrid VRM design, is hybrid voltage control. Like the hybrid voltage controller, like it's partially analog. So things like the switching frequency are set by resistors. Or in the case of the X470 Gaming Plus, the switching frequency is actually just automatically adjusted by the voltage controller itself. That controller idles at 300 kilohertz, and then full load it runs 450, which is kind of a neat power saving feature. The Gigabyte board just sits at 350 kilohertz all the time. And well, it does help their VRM temperatures because they're not running a high switching frequency and therefore they have lower switching losses, but it would theoretically that does negatively impact your overclocking capabilities because you'd have more voltage output. Well, you'd have more voltage ripple on the output of the VRM and you'd have worse transient response. So yeah, just like, okay, so it didn't overheat, and it does have BCLK, but I'd really say if you want to push an 8-core around, you're going to want the Gaming Plus. Or the Gaming Pro Carbon, because the Gaming Pro Carbon with its configurable switching frequency, so the parentheses values are the actual measured oscilloscope frequencies, because the software I set 300 kilohertz, and it actually ran 350, and at that point, at 1.3 volts, like, it ice cold. Like, compared to the other boards here, this is ice cold. Like, it was doing low 80, like, under 80 degrees on the VRM. And it's not like the ambient was that much lower than, like, the highest ambient I tested at. So, absolutely killer results right there, right off the bat with 1.3 volts. 600 kilohertz, 1.3 volts, still only, like, low 80s, which is really impressive. And then when I cranked it all the way up to 1 megahertz, which it admittedly didn't hit. The board only got all the way up to 900 kilohertz, not the full 1000. It was still only doing a little over 100, which is like, that is seriously impressive as far as I'm concerned. Because I was honestly like, if you look at the Asus board, like that Asus board is doing almost, actually it's like, if you go with the K-type temperature, because that's the temperature off of the back of the board. That's the software reading right there, the 103, that's software. So if you compare the back of the board temperature for the Gaming Pro Carbon versus the Asus board, it's just like, well, this is better. That's at 300 kilohertz more switching frequency than the Asus board has. And then when I crank it up to 1.4 volts, 1.4 volts, 300 kilohertz, 93 degrees. Like, this is running 1.4 volts at, like, the same temperature that all the other boards are doing for 1.3. Like, oh my god. That's ridiculous. It's absolutely insane. So, at 300 kilohertz, this thing is just one of the coolest, like, straight up coolest running VRM I've tested. And then when you crank it all the way up to 1,000 kilohertz, it still doesn't overheat, which really, really surprised me because like the Asus board at 600 kilohertz, the Asus board straight up shut down, and that's on 40 amp power stages from International Rectifier. It also has a completely pathetic heatsink. So yeah, MSI's heatsink here really goes far because like, damn, like you can crank that switching frequency up so high and it still didn't manage to overheat. Admittedly, at this point, the temperatures are kind of unacceptable for like, warm climate use, but it's also Prime 95. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm just impressed. Like, I'm honestly just impressed that the board like still didn't manage to overheat at at 900 kilohertz real. And if you ran it at like 600, I'd say that's completely acceptable. That right there. 600 kilohertz, just completely adequate running temperature. Considering how much switching frequency it's running and the voltage, right? So yeah, if you're gonna want to max out like this is something I'd really wonder about is like, would you actually, if you were doing static overclocking, so just running fixed voltage, fixed frequency, if you set the Gaming Pro Carbon to like 600 or maybe 800 kilohertz, would you notice a difference would there be a difference between overclocking on the Gaming Pro Carbon and something like the Crosshair 7 Hero? Because I don't think there would be. I think honestly, because this is the MSI board is a real, like it's a true 5-phase. The Crosshair 7 Hero is a 5-phase with doubling. So it's just like, given enough switching, like the Crosshair 7 Hero should run significantly cooler. But this should be able to keep up with it as far as like output voltage ripple and all of that goes. There will be some differences. I do think there's actually some differences in the bypass capacitors and like the filtering on the output of the VRM. But the VRM itself, like they should be really close together. So yeah, I'm really, really impressed because this is one of those, like this is a board where you can realistically actually just crank up the switching frequency if you want to try, I don't know how much difference it would actually make. I've not tested that yet, but I'd expect it, going from 300 kilohertz to 600 kilohertz. I wouldn't be surprised if that picked up, say, 25 megahertz more core clock for a given voltage. That wouldn't be too much of a surprise to me. Going from 600 kilohertz to 1,000, I'm going to say you're not going to see much of a difference at that point. But 300 to 600 kilohertz, or 300 to like 800, somewhere between 600 and 1,000. That could, help out with overclocking a bit. And, and it still wouldn't overheat. Like, because the other thing is like, yeah, you could also change the switching frequency on the Asus X470 Prime Pro board. It'll just crash if you run any heavy workload long enough, right? At which point it's just like, well, that's rather pointless, isn't it? And I don't have any other high-end boards to compare against, so yeah, I don't know how it compares against the other high-end boards, but I'm impressed. Like this could be just VRM. Like, I'm super pleased with the VRM. The only real complaint I have for the X470 Gaming Pro Carbon is it doesn't have the BCLK overclocking, and it didn't have offset voltage last I checked. But as far as the VRM and its cooling goes, amazing. Like, for the fact that it's just under $200, it is absolutely amazing. So actually, it might not even be just under $200, but it's like, I was really expecting a lot worse. And instead I got I got impressed, like straight up surprised, because I didn't think it would do 900 kilohertz at all. So yeah, let's swap the boards and end the video there, because actually I'll just end on the test results, because quite frankly, who cares about looking at me, right? Data is much more interesting than I am. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching. Thanks to the patrons for funding the purchase of all of the motherboards on this test. Actually, all of the X470 motherboards and AM4 motherboards I have. I still have 2 more motherboards to test, the ASRock X470 Master SLI and the MSI B450M, what was it? Mortar? I think it's called the Mortar Arctic. MSI has stupid motherboard names. But yeah, those 2 boards are up next. I'll probably do them together as well. And honestly, I think, like, I do believe, like, the B450M might be able to give the MSI X470 Gaming Plus a run for its money as best budget VRM. Though that board actually downgrades the MOSFETs and has a better heatsink. So, like, we'll see if the heatsink upgrade can make up for the MOSFET downgrade, but that would be really neat if there was, like, a B450 board that would, like, had a really solid VRM. Admittedly, it's a really expensive B450 board, but it's also MATX, and I know a lot of people who are like, yo, what's the best MATX motherboard? Well, that looks like it could be one of them, because it's basically the MSI X470 Gaming Plus VRM with slightly worse MOSFETs and a bigger heatsink. So yeah, I'm excited for that one. Anyway, all of the boards, you know, thanks patrons for funding them, because it does mean that I can say pretty much whatever I feel like about them. Detrimental to the manufacturers on that end. And what else was there? Right, I want to thank alza.co.uk for loaning me the 2700X that I'm using. Also, speaking of Alza, I'm actually going to be at a actually I'll do that as separate announcement thing. Anyway, let's just close it out here. So yeah, thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking. I have a Patreon. There's also t-shirts you can buy. You can find a link to all of that down in the description below. And yeah, I think I've wasted enough of, well, not wasted enough of your time, but that's it for the video. Goodbye. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Where's the stop button? There it is.